The children now love luxury.
Das ist meins.
They have bad manners and contempt for authority. Ranting like this about teenagers behaving badly was Socrates more than 2,000 years ago. Today, scientists know teenage rampage is a necessary part of growing up.
Das war schon eine rebellische Zeit.
It was a rebellious time. We broke into our school.
Ik heb vaak ruzie gemaakt met mijn ouders.
I argued a lot with my parents. They thought I drank too much and stayed out too long.
En te laat wegbleef.
Stealing road signs comes to mind. So, just pulling down stop signs or street signs. I have no idea why.
I think I first fell in love when I was 13.
Hormones go crazy, and the brain turns into a construction site. Teenagers go mad. And parents do too. But puberty is also a time full of wonder and excitement. Only now, researchers have discovered how important it is for human development. Teenagers are fascinating. They're no longer children, but they're not grown-ups either. Between the ages of 10 and 18, their bodies and brains change completely. During this transitional phase, they're irritable and sensitive, but also curious and creative. Girls enter puberty first, usually when they're around 10. Boys follow 1 to 2 years later. Childhood ends, and teenagers not only get rid of their old toys, they become more self-reliant and independent. They hang out more with their friends. Parents are suddenly as uncool as their old fluffy toys. Puberty is triggered by biochemical messengers. Sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone are responsible for turning children into sexually mature adults. The resulting emotional turmoil makes sense biologically. It ensures the survival of our species, because teenagers have to leave their parents to find genetically unrelated sex partners and start their own families. But first, their bodies grow frighteningly fast. In 1 year, teenagers can gain up to 10 centimeters in height. Arms and legs grow longer. And not just that. Girls grow breasts and their hips become rounder. Boys develop wider shoulders and stronger muscles. Hairs grow everywhere, and the first beard stubble appears. Annoying pimples disfigure faces, and voices suddenly sound different. But above all, the genitals grow to their full size. We're genetically pre-programmed to undergo puberty, but the onset seems to be flexible. Scientists have found out that girls today enter puberty earlier than ever before. In 1860, puberty started at the age of 13. In 1960, at age 11, and now at age 9 or 10. This is partly due to our more nutritious diet, because our bodies produce pubertal hormones only when they have enough fat reserves. But a fat, protein-rich diet doesn't explain everything. Researchers think that it's also chemicals disrupting our hormonal balance. The main suspects are plasticizers, pesticides, and even cosmetics. This clinic in Montpellier, in southern France, treats teenagers who suffer from early puberty. Families seek advice from specialists treating hormonal imbalances in children. Charles Sultan has been researching the influence of environmental pollutants on teenagers for years.
On comprend que cette contamination, qu'elle soit prénatale.
We know that this contamination, be it prenatal or postnatal, can influence the onset of puberty. It can have an estrogen-like effect.
Et eu égard à cet effet estrogène-like, eh bien, on va imprégner cette...
This means that young girls are exposed to estrogens that can stimulate the mammary glands, the uterus, and the nerve centers that regulate the onset of puberty.
Qui régule le déclenchement de la puberté.
The area around Montpellier is a famous wine-growing region. To maximize yields, winemakers use pesticides. The father of these two children has been working with these chemicals for years. The boy entered puberty rather late, but his little sister started far too early, at the age of 7.5. A burden for the girl, but also for her mother.
Ma fille aurait aujourd'hui donc presque 10 ans. C'était très difficile.
My daughter is nearly 10. It's difficult to accept this change. Her friends are only now beginning to grow breasts and wear bras. My daughter has been wearing them for 2 years. So she was 7 or 8 years old when she started wearing bras. The girl is embarrassed and the family doesn't want to be recognized. The mother hopes that the endocrinologist can help her daughter. Charles Sultan usually treats children who suffer from a genetic disorder or a tumor that speeds up or delays puberty. But for several years, an increasing number of children have been coming to see him who have no organic disorders, just like the little girl.
D'accord. Quelle danse? Classique?
Non, hip-hop.
Du?
Hip-hop.
Hip-hop. D'accord.
Et des fois Zumba.
Et Zumba. D'accord. Nous sommes confrontés à une véritable épidémie.
We're facing a real epidemic of precocious puberty.
Dans le service, il y a 10
10 or 15 years ago, we had about 20 cases per year.
Précocité pubertaire à équipe constante.
Last year, we had to treat 106 or 108 cases of precocious puberty.
106 ou 108.
That's 6 times as much.
C'est-à-dire 6 fois plus.
For the girl, it's a handicap to enter puberty at such an early age. All her friends are still children, and she herself is one too.
Et elle a très bien compris et elle a surtout compris qu'elle voulait.
She understands this very well, and she's made it very clear that she doesn't want to menstruate in 2nd grade
Parce que ce serait la seule de sa classe.
because she'd be the only one in her class. This is difficult to cope with when you're only 10, so we want to treat her fairly quickly before she goes back to school. Hormone blockers can delay the onset of puberty, but first, the doctor must know how far advanced her development is. Charles Sultan works with X-ray specialists. Adolescents have so-called growth plates in their bones. At the end of puberty, these growth plates disappear. A radiograph of the plates on the girl's hand shows that her puberty is far advanced. Also, the girl's uterus is almost fully developed. If left untreated, the hormone disorder can have severe effects.
Une enfant qui entre en puberté plus tôt va développer
A child that enters puberty too early can later suffer from obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and lipid disorders. There are lots of risks.
Un terrain à risque.
Experts advise children to avoid hormone-like substances. This could also mean reducing the use of skin creams or other cosmetics.
Ils contiennent des parabens, ils contiennent des phtalates, ils contiennent des nanoparticules, ils contiennent du titane.
They contain parabens, phthalates, nanoparticles, and titanium.
Je cite les cosmétiques.
So why do I talk about
Qui a
cosmetics?
été publiée récemment.
Because recently, a US study was published showing that when adolescent girls reduce the use of these cosmetics for just a few weeks, the level of endocrine disruptors in their blood drops. Hormones are a vital part of the signaling system in our bodies. They also trigger puberty. It starts in our brains. A gland, the so-called hypophysis, releases hormones that initiate various processes in our bodies. Ovaries and testicles start working and also begin producing hormones. Estrogen in girls and testosterone in boys. By the way, both hormones occur in both sexes, just in different quantities. Not only the body changes during puberty, the brain also gets rebuilt completely. Just a few years ago, scientists believed that brain development stopped at the age of 6. But now we know that the brain grows and restructures itself during puberty. For scientists, the adolescent brain is a fascinating research area. Only 25 years ago, neurologists began to explore how adolescents think and feel. One of their main motivations is to find out why not all children become mentally healthy adults.
Wir erforschen die Adoleszenz und die adoleszente Hirn.
We study adolescence and the development of the brain during adolescence, mainly to get more information about why this is such a vulnerable phase in life.
Also eine Lebensphase, wo wir wissen, dass ganz viele psychische
We know
Störungen.
that many mental disorders manifest themselves at this stage.
Das steht ja so ein bisschen im
This is a bit of a contradiction to the robustness of young people, their great physical health.
physischen Gesundheit und trotzdem
And
ist
yet,
es eine
at this stage in life,
Lebensphase,
many
wo
accidents
viele
happen,
Unfälle,
many deaths occur,
passieren, wo eben auch viele
and many
Todesfälle
psychological
passieren,
disturbances
wo aber
begin,
auch ganz viele psychische Störungen ihren
be it
Ausgang
depression,
nehmen.
anxiety
Sei es
disorders,
Depressionen,
eating disorders,
Angststörungen,
or substance abuse.
Essstörungen, aber auch Substanzmissbrauch.
To understand and treat these diseases, researchers must look into the brain. This is best done with magnetic resonance tomography. The resulting images of the teenage brain are somewhat surprising. They show that entire regions are being remodeled.
Amazingly, it actually does seem to be like a construction site. So there are a whole bunch of different processes taking place at once. So it's actually very hard to get a complete understanding of all of these things that are happening. But there's some things we do know pretty well at this point. So one of the things that we see when we look at a brain changing from childhood into adolescence into young adulthood and adulthood is we see a thinning out of the cortical sheet, the gray matter of the brain.
Brain researchers compare this thinning of the grey matter with the pruning of a tree, because this is exactly what happens in the pubescent brain. Unneeded connections are cut, so others can become stronger. This allows the brain to become more effective.
The brain's doing as it reshapes itself is deciding what are the circuits that I use and need, and what are the circuits that have proven themselves less useful. And as we mature, we actually clean out, we prune, like cutting off the branches of a tree, the connections that aren't being used or aren't supporting behaviors that are reinforced. And instead, we grow our branches toward the behaviors that are really supportive of healthy functioning.
Therefore, our childhood experiences determine our adolescence and our adulthood only to a certain extent. During puberty, all the experiences and insights gained so far are put to the test. The brain selects and recombines. Never again will our brains be as malleable as during this phase.
If the brain is more plastic, is ready to be shaped more during adolescence, then the activities of adolescence are the ones that are most likely to stick with us. And it may be a missed opportunity for learning and for growth if one only pursues sort of narrow activities, like they're too focused on one thing. But I would hate to describe any of those behaviors as necessarily negative or bad or dangerous behaviors. It depends on the context in which they're enacted. And broadly speaking, I think, in general, moderation is a good idea for adults and adolescents alike.
Learning something new, trying out unusual things. That's what Zoe's done. She's just turned 18. She thinks the most important thing is gaining as much experience as possible during puberty. She's a Girl Scout. And a few years ago, she discovered archery. People discover their hobbies by accident. Archery works great for me because it calms me down. Even as a teenager, you're under enormous pressure. Here, I can just concentrate on the arrows and the target and forget all the other stuff in my head. Zoe knows what her aim in life is. She wants to be an actress. The story is I'm a big Harry Potter fan. When I was 11, I thought I'd get invited to Hogwarts. It never happened. I was very disappointed and wondered what I could do instead if I couldn't become a sorceress. And then I thought, I'd become an actress, so I can be whatever I want. Zoe doesn't want to lose sight of her aim, but she knows that sometimes she needs the help of others. Especially at this age, you need someone who helps you to find out what you like. And I think that unfortunately, parents sometimes aren't the right people for that. Often, parents simply can't do what their teenage kids can. During puberty, teenagers are at the peak of their mental and physical abilities. Scientists speak of fluid intelligence, the ability to think spontaneously and creatively. Adults, on the other hand, have a more crystalline, knowledge-based intelligence. Teenagers also have their own rhythms. For the vast majority of them, this means turning into night owls. They go to bed late and can't get up in the morning. But it's not only smartphones that are responsible for this. Nature condemns teenagers to be creatures of the night.
Man kann sagen, geh früher ins Bett, dann
You can tell them, go to bed early, so you can get up early. But that's not very fruitful, because the teenage body clock does something nasty. Before it opens the window for sleep, it makes sure that you cannot fall asleep for a few hours beforehand. This means that I can tell teenagers to go to bed early, but that doesn't mean that they can fall asleep.
Weil ins Bett gehen kann man immer, aber einschlafen kann der deshalb noch nicht.
Again, it's all down to chemistry. During puberty, the body releases the sleep hormone melatonin 2 hours later than in adults.
Wenn man in der Mitte seiner Nacht geweckt
If you get woken up in the middle of the night, you're not going to be receptive, neither for food nor for knowledge. The second problem is that you're missing half a night. This half of the night is incredibly important for our brains to memorize what we've learned. Unfortunately, school timetables don't take that into consideration. Lessons often begin early in the morning, for children as well as for adolescents. Everyone must get up early and be on time. Except for Carsten. The 15-year-old is allowed to come to class late. For him and his classmates, lessons start an hour later. This school in Alsdorf, Germany, has set up a flexi-time system for their teenage students. This is part of a research project to find out whether starting classes later in the day makes learning easier. The students think it's great. I now come to school much more relaxed than before, because I don't feel so drained. In the past, before we had this system, and the first lesson was German or maths or English, I often saw the topic and thought, "Oh, teacher, please be quiet and leave me alone," or something like that. And now it's all right. I have my freedom. I can get organized and I have enough sleep. I often dawdle in the morning and I sleep for half an hour longer. Then I'm better at getting ready in the morning and have a healthy breakfast. I'm also much fitter during the day.
ist man auch viel fitter im Tag.
You know, if you've worked as a teacher for many years, you're aware of the problem with the first lesson in the morning, especially in the higher grades. You realize that the students are still very tired, especially at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we really started thinking about this when we learned that the students have a completely different sleep pattern. And then we asked ourselves, why not change the way school works? It's obvious that we shouldn't ignore this and that we should do something about it. The school decided to put the findings of the adolescents researchers into practice. The students can now synchronize their learning pattern with their individual biorhythm. For research purposes, students have to carry so-called actimeters on their wrists. These devices measure every movement and record sleep and activity patterns. In addition, the students keep a diary of when they went to bed and when they woke up.
Bin ich denn gestern eingeschlafen?
The scientists also want to know whether the new system helps the youngsters to get more sleep, or whether they simply go to bed later. The project has just started, and the chronobiologists are beginning to evaluate the data from the sleep diaries and the actimeters. The devices record every little snooze, even 10-minute cat naps. So now we have enough data from 85 people to start evaluation. What you can see very nicely is that this person has been getting up very regularly at the same time every day during school days. And on weekends, they slept much longer and woke up later. The wake-up time is very different. Down here you can see this, for example. If you could sleep for an hour longer every night, you would gain a whole night in 1 week, because that's 1 hour a day for 5 days, so 5 hours of extra sleep. Extra sleep that hopefully has a positive effect on the student's ability to learn. We always get asked, and have the grades gone up? I can't tell you right now. And I also think that we have to look at the longer term. Within 2 months, the grades won't improve dramatically. But I can imagine that if we look at the results in 2 years or so, we will see that something has changed. But it's obvious that the students are happier and more alert. One example where adolescents research has made life easier for students, parents, and teachers alike. Dozy in school, death-defying in their spare time. Puberty is a phase of risk-seeking and irrational behavior. Looking for the kick often leads to accidents or even death. But where does this penchant for peril come from? This is what adolescence researchers at the University of Leiden in Holland want to find out. These teenagers are no crazy climbers, and the researchers don't want them to scale skyscrapers. Instead, they let them play with their laptops. In the lab, pubescent daredevilry is measured with bursting digital balloons. Tersa and Sven get money for every pump stroke. If they risk too much and burst the balloon, they lose their money. This simple test lets brain researcher Sabine Peters determine who likes to play safe and who doesn't. Of course, the Dutch researchers also want to look into the heads of the teenagers. Hence, they scan their subjects with a magnetic resonance tomograph. Again, the teenagers are asked to inflate balloons while the scientists observe what's going on in their brains. The researchers have made a surprising discovery. Adolescents rarely think rationally, at least not when they have to assess risks. Their behavior is somewhat spontaneous and reflexive. It's controlled by evolutionarily ancient brain structures.
Er zijn twee hele belangrijke hersensystemen die...
There are two very important regions of the brain that are interesting for adolescence research. One is the cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex here at the front. These are brain areas that are important for the evaluation of your actions, smart thinking, forward planning, things like that. The other regions are deeper in the brain. These areas are evolutionarily older. It can also be found in many animals. There's the emotional system, for example, which was active while you did the balloon task. And we think that these areas are especially active in adolescents compared to children and adults. In contrast, the more rational areas of the brain, what we call the cortex, that sit on the outside of the brain, are just a little less developed in adolescence. The brain stem belongs to the older parts of the brain and regulates reflexes like breathing and swallowing. The cerebellum and the limbic system control emotions, pleasure and risk-taking. The cerebrum is the youngest part of the brain, the so-called grey matter. During puberty, the cerebrum is remodeled from back to front. The control system for rational thinking, the prefrontal cortex, is the last area to be rebuilt. An explanation for why even reasonable teenagers often act unreasonably.
Vaak als je het aan tieners vraagt, dan kunnen ze van tevoren...
Often when you ask teens in advance, they can clearly say that it's probably not a good idea, for instance, to jump a red light, because this can cause an accident. But when they're together with their friends, for example, they no longer think about this. They're more concerned with the short term than the long term. So teenagers don't lack insight. They sometimes simply don't care about the consequences. This is why awareness campaigns with wagging fingers make little sense.
Het konijn heb je ook al goed, die zit in het middelste. Hier weer positieve feedback. Gaat goed.
Sabina Peters wants to know, how can you change pubescent behavior without getting on teenagers' nerves?
Daar thuis hoort en bij deze bijvoorbeeld zou ik dan een van de andere hokjes kunnen kiezen. Wat ik in mijn studie vond is dat...
What I found out in my study is that the brains of young people don't react as well to negative feedback. The older you get, the more our brains can respond to negative feedback. I think that's because it's a lot harder to process. With positive feedback, you can just copy what you did before. But with negative feedback, you need to stop and think. What do I have to do differently? That needs more mental capacity, and I think that's why youngsters find it more difficult. With the right feedback, teenagers are capable of amazing things, and they can be very persistent. Instead of walking on 2 legs, Camden spends most of his time on 4 wheels.
Man hat halt für sich einfach immer den Kick.
You just get a kick out of it. The best thing is to focus on a trick that you want to master and then spend 2 hours practicing it. Then you crash. And finally, you manage to do it. That's just the best feeling. Numerous studies show that sport not only trains the muscles, but also positively influences the psyche. It's simply about achieving something. Of course, this somehow affects the personality. It certainly boosts your self-confidence. Doing sport releases endorphins. These are hormones that cause feelings of happiness. This reward system is not something unique to humans. Animals also like to get high. Dolphins, for example. They get a kick by nibbling on pufferfishes. The fish releases a toxin that acts as a drug. The dolphins quickly suck on the fish and then pass it on to their buddies. This behavior is especially common among juvenile dolphins. The desire for getting intoxicated in groups is also something that interests adolescence researchers at Temple University in Philadelphia. They want to know how teenage mice deal with drugs. Like many other animals, these mice like drinking alcohol. The researchers want to investigate whether juvenile mice change their alcohol consumption when they're hanging out with their buddies. The results are surprising.
We put them in, and now we measure how much time did they spend at the sipping tubes. And what we found was a very compelling pattern, very, very similar to what we've seen in humans. First, for the animals that were tested alone, what you see is that they spent about the same amount of time drinking, whether they were adolescents or adult mice. But now what happens when you put them into the cage with other animals? And here, the pattern is very, very different. And what you see is that for only the adolescent mice, they increase their drinking time. They spend more time drinking just because there are other adolescent mice in the cage with them. In the adults, it doesn't change their drinking patterns at all.
The fun-loving teenage mice help answer some basic questions about the risk behavior of adolescent humans too.
Is the kid making these decisions to be more risky, to be more sensation-seeking, because they're imagining that that's what their friends want? It's sort of a social cognition. They're intentionally thinking about the social situation and then changing their own behavior because they think that's what their friends expect of them. Well, we don't think mice do this sort of thinking at all. Mice, we think, are much more reactive to their environment and driven more by their biology than by future thinking.
So it's nature, not nurture, that dictates the behavior of teenagers when they're hanging out with their peers. The so-called traffic light test helps researchers determine the influence of friends on adolescent risk behavior. Subjects are asked to drive a car. They need to get as far as they can in 10 minutes without risking a crash. The researchers want to know, do teenagers take higher risks when they're together with friends?
An adolescent driver is much more likely to be in a serious accident when they've got other passengers in the car. For older drivers, the number of passengers in the vehicle really doesn't affect the likelihood that they'll be in an accident.
Hey, Farah. Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Good.
And in fact, as soon as the friend sits in the passenger seat, the driver's willingness to drive more recklessly increases, in girls as well as in boys.
The reason why adolescents are more likely to be risky when they're with their friends isn't because their friends are telling them what to do. It's not because they're trying to impress their friends. It's because being with friends activates parts of the brain that lead you to be driven to pursue rewards and to experience those rewards differently.
Young people are simply hardwired to look to their friends for recognition. They need peers to be happy and to gain self-confidence. To be in a community of like-minded individuals is essential for teenagers. The same makeup, the same music, the same parties. This makes biological sense because strong social bonds outside the family group are important for being successful later in life. Teenagers need to be able to separate successfully from their parents and start their own family. Teenagers must create a new world, their own world. However, peer groups are getting increasingly bigger thanks to social networks. 20 years ago, teenagers had 10 friends in the neighborhood. Today, they have hundreds all over the world. Teenagers check their phones first thing in the morning and last thing at night. The smartphone is perhaps the greatest revolution since the printing press was invented nearly 600 years ago. Teenagers are digital natives. They spend their lives being online, and parents worry.
All right, so we're ready to get started. So you both see pictures.
The American scientist Lauren Sherman has grown up with Facebook herself. She's decided to research the impact of social media on teenagers. She wants to know whether Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook influence their behavior. How do they react to recognition or rejection on the internet? In her study, she's found out that the number of positive reviews influences teenagers' own opinions. They tend to see a photo with many likes more positively than one without. And when it comes to their own photos, digital recognition is almost like a drug.
When they did get a lot of likes on their photos, they would show greater activation in an area called the nucleus accumbens. And this is the part of the brain that's involved in the experience of reward. So it is involved in that feeling of pleasure in the moment. But I think what's really interesting about it is it's also involved in motivating future behavior and in learning.
So parents can rest assured, social networks help teenagers gain valuable insights into their socio-cultural environment. But the question remains, do they have to do this all day long?
I do think that it is certainly the case that teens have more access to their peers than they have before. And that's something you can just look at the way that social media works at this point, right? So if you're a teenager and you have a smartphone, you have access to your peers really at any time. And so they have a social environment even when they're in their home, even when they're not surrounded by people physically.
Social networks are a challenge for parents and teenagers alike, just like telephones, radio, and television when they were invented. Brain researchers, at least, are not really concerned.
I am not aware of any evidence to suggest that it is damaging the brain, that it is making us stupider, that it is having some sort of horrible long-term effect. But certainly it is changing the brain. There's no question about that.
Sieht traurig aus. Ich finde, sieht so aus, als hätte gerade irgendwie.
During puberty, the brain has an enormous amount of work to do. No wonder it sometimes makes mistakes. For example, studies have shown that teenagers have trouble interpreting facial expressions. This could explain why they often react so unpredictably.
Ja, fröhlich und glücklich. Fällt das voll schwer gerade.
This also explains teenage tantrums. The prefrontal cortex is out of action. Hence, parents have the unwelcome benefit of experiencing their offspring's unfiltered emotions. More positive feelings are equally powerful. Most of us remember our first teenage love, the butterflies in our stomachs and our throbbing hearts. Brain researchers see this rather more soberly. For them, love equals neurons firing intensely. For decades, the New York-based neurobiologist Lucy Brown has been researching the most beautiful of all emotions. She's discovered that love originates in a very ancient part of our brain that we cannot control consciously.
It's the same part of the brain that controls reflexes like swallowing or like your eye movements, the things you don't think about. We don't think about standing up against gravity. That's where the activity is. And when we first saw these data, then we knew romantic love it's a drive. It's not an emotion we think about just being euphoric when we're in love, that wonderful emotion, or anxious. But we can have many emotions around love. The core feature of romantic love is this drive system. That's what's there. It's like the drive for hunger.
It's the same part of our brain that's involved in drug addiction. No wonder lovers feel dependent on each other.
And when we look at this area of the brain, when we look at what are the cells there, what chemicals might be there, what chemicals might be important for this behavior, we're going to go and look at another picture of the cells in the brain in that very region, all cells that contain dopamine. They're in this ventral tegmental area. They produce the dopamine, they produce the signals. They have these long little wispy-like, they're called axons, but they're hair-like, that go forward in the brain to tell our cortex and more cognitive areas, focus, find that person.
A beautiful addiction, as long as both partners feel the same. But what happens when one of the two suddenly falls out of love? Then there's only one thing the spurned can do.
When you're addicted to a drug, sometimes it's cold turkey, sometimes it has to be slower, but you have to get yourself away from that drug. And it's the same thing. Better, if you can do it, when you're heartbroken, throw away all the pictures. I mean, Facebook even has a function now so that you can cut out all references to that person.
But what if parents don't agree with their children's choice of partner? Is it possible to separate star-crossed lovers?
It's like in Romeo and Juliet. If you set up a barrier, you're just going to make the wish for the other person stronger. It really is true. Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
But for some young people, it's not their first love that keeps them up at night, but the question of who they really are. Boy or girl? Do they want to be a man or a woman in later life? Jessica is celebrating her 17th birthday as a girl. She was born a boy, but she always felt that she was in the wrong body. With the onset of puberty, she took a decision.
Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, liebe Jessica. Happy birthday to you.
In my case, I lived through 2 years of the male puberty biologically intended by my body. Then at the age of 14, I was fortunate to be able to stop it. My doctor gave me a drug that arrested male puberty, and then it all stopped. Turning from a boy into a girl is a long and arduous process. Jessica has been undergoing psychotherapeutic treatment for years. It was only when she was diagnosed with a real gender identity disorder that she was able to get prescription hormones. The hormone therapy drugs stop puberty. The natural testosterone in my body is blocked. The artificial estrogen that I take further reduces testosterone levels and triggers female puberty. Jessica's doctor is Bernd Meyenburg, a specialist for gender identity disorders. When he opened his practice 40 years ago, he only had adult patients. Today, he's treating an increasing number of adolescents.
Puberty ist eine große Leidenszeit für die Betroffenen.
Puberty can be a time of great suffering for those affected. We see some really serious depressions, self-harm and suicide attempts. And because these young people feel so hopeless, so stuck in a dead end, it's good that we can help them in the long term. Depending on the diagnosis, doctors prescribe hormone therapy drugs that interrupt puberty, or others that turn a male into a female body. This is controversial, but many scientists believe that the benefits of early treatment outweigh the drawbacks. We now have a whole range of studies showing that the results are simply so much better. For example, if we prevent boys from getting beards and deep voices, it helps them get through puberty better. Similarly, we can save girls from having to undergo operations for breast formation later in life. Of course, it would be easier if biological sex and gender identity always corresponded. But little is known about the causes of gender identity disorders. Some might be caused by an imbalance in the level of sex hormones during fetal development.
There
is a small time window during pregnancy. Not during the whole pregnancy, but only the last third of pregnancy. Studies have shown that if different hormones prevail during that time, the controls in the brain can be reversed. Biologically a boy, but emotionally a girl. The hormones Jessica is now taking are intended to unite her mind and body. A complex process, both physically and emotionally. The hormones not only affect my body, but also what happens inside my head. I become more emotional. My mind, which was dominated by testosterone, is turning into a more female mind. So it's not just the genes that define our sex. But still, many things are gender-specific. For example, boys' brains are 10% bigger than girls'. But that doesn't mean that they are 10% smarter. The male brain processes the hormones serotonin and testosterone differently, so boys find it harder to sit still. Girls have better language skills. In turn, boys have a better sense of direction. All this has been proven in scientific studies. The aim of this task is to find out how well you can imagine things in your head when you twist them. For example, when you read a map, are you someone who's more likely to turn the map? Child psychiatrist Kerstin Conrad analyzes the differences between boys and girls. She wants to know how much is genetically pre-programmed, how much is hormonally controlled, and how much is education. Usually, boys find these spatial awareness tasks much easier than girls. However, researchers only detect these differences during or after puberty. The level of testosterone seems to play a role. Also, women have a better sense of direction during some phases of their menstrual cycle. Something is happening with their brains during this time. Kerstin Conrad wants to know how important gender stereotypes are during childhood and adolescence, and why there are exceptions. You've done really well. You've collected an unusually high amount of points for a girl, and you were unusually fast. Great. There are super girls, as we've seen just now, and there are very weak boys. But if you do big studies and compare large samples, then there's a tendency for boys to do better in the mental rotation task than girls. Here too, we assume that hormones have a great influence.
dass Hormone einen wichtigen Einfluss dabei haben.
The sex hormones estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone also affect the brain. They let some brain regions grow faster in boys than in girls, and vice versa. One of the results is a different emotional sensitivity. These electrodes measure skin tension and heart rate. The researchers want to know, does Ilya feel different from Rachel? Just watch the movie clip on the screen. I want to ask you to watch it and sit quietly without moving. This film clip is aimed to arouse emotions. In it, a bear cub sees its mother being killed by loose rocks while she's looking for honey. Girls usually react more emotionally than boys, probably because their amygdala is of a different size and shape. This brain region controls emotions and can be involved in causing depression. There might be a connection with psychological diseases. For example, boys after puberty have a larger amygdala than girls. The larger volume is perhaps a protection against psychological disorders related to the control of emotions, such as depression and anxiety disorders. Boys are much less affected by that than girls, but only after puberty. Before puberty, we see depression as often in boys as in girls. Puberty lasts for 8 years. It's a time full of struggles and conflicts, but also of chances and possibilities. Children become adults. During puberty, the brain is extremely flexible and adolescents are extremely receptive. Physically and mentally, they're at the peak of their abilities. With the right support, teenagers can learn a lot. Research shows that puberty doesn't have to be a time of horrors, neither for parents nor for teenagers. On the contrary, it's a time full of miracles that determines how we lead the rest of our lives. It's a critical phase, during which a lot can go wrong, but it's also a phase of great opportunities that can and should be seized. When you're young, you're more flexible. This means that people take greater risks and are more comfortable with new situations, regardless of whether they end well or not.
In the end, this is our biology. This is the biology that we have evolved to possess. And so you're going to see this behavior manifested, I think, throughout human time.
The reassuring thing is that usually even the most rebellious teenagers turn into well-adjusted adults. They will make their way and shape their world. And at some point, just like Socrates, they will probably grumble about today's youth having bad manners.